Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see some friendly older faces, older friends, and also new faces and friends out there. I'm very excited about my new book being published. I've been working probably 27 years on this, and that's a bigger lifetime that it takes to have a baby born. This is a very, very long labor. I'm going to share a few thoughts before I show some slides. And basically what I'll be doing tonight is sharing some of the stories that are in this book. And for the last 60 years, I've had the amazing opportunity to be a part of nonviolent movements and experimenting with the power of nonviolence in this country and around the world. And I feel that one of our problems today is many people have given up hope that we can make any difference, that we can really make change. And my hope is that with this book and sharing these stories, that people will be inspired that we can make a difference. Our nation and our world are addicted to violence and war. This has brought the untold suffering and death to millions of people, and to hundreds of millions more who have had to flee their homes as refugees, and has cost trillions of dollars in money down the rat hole of war, which is not available for meeting human and environmental needs, both in this country and around the world. And yet we continue that addiction. It's as if there's no alternative to war and violence as a way of resolving conflict. And I believe that just as we ended slavery, just as we've ended cannibalism, as we ended women being second-class citizens, as we ended Jim Crow in the south of this country, we can end war. And maybe that's a radical thought, but I'm a part of something called World Beyond War, building a global movement to end all war. And if you're interested, we'll be sending around a sign-up sheet where you can sign a declaration of peace that you will not participate in war and that you will work nonviolently to end all war. And you can look at our website, worldbeyondwar.org, to learn a whole lot more. The good news is that people all over the world are discovering the power of nonviolent action and nonviolent means to resist oppression, dictatorship, war, and violence of all kinds. In the last 40, 50 years, more than half the world's people live in countries where there have been major nonviolent movements. And many of those have been successful. I commend to you, in addition to my book, a book called Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, where they have studied 323 violent and nonviolent movements over the last 110 years, and found the nonviolent movements to be more than twice as likely to be successful. So for people that say, if nothing else works, try violence and war, this should put an end to that discussion. And in addition to being twice as likely to be successful, most of those movements have ended up in democracy and not in further civil war or more dictatorship. So that's another book to put on your reading list. I had the good fortune, one, to choose good parents, but also to have in my life what I call spiritual giants, people that were walking their talk and were using their lives to really try to create a more peaceful and just world and experiment with the power of nonviolence. Those include Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, A.J. Muste, and many others. Thank you very much. So I think we'll get on with the slides, which are photos that are in the book and basically illustrate some of the stories. Partly influenced by meeting Martin Luther King in Montgomery, Alabama during the Montgomery bus boycott, and encouragement by my friend Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington in 1963, I decided to go to Howard University, which was a black university in Washington, D.C. And I started there in the fall of 1959, and in February of 1960, soon after, 4 students down in Greensboro, North Carolina, found their courage and decided to challenge segregation in the South. And went to a lunch counter very much like this, were not served, and were arrested and sent to jail. Well, at Howard University, which was almost totally a black university, we did a little research and found that in Maryland and Virginia, everything was segregated. Lunch counters, restaurants, motels, drinking fountains, toilets, movie theaters, playgrounds. And we started going up to Maryland to challenge some of the, to go into the lunch counters to challenge the segregation laws there. We usually went on Saturday morning, would be arrested, they'd take us to jail, and we'd spend the weekend singing freedom songs. And on Monday morning, would get released and go back to classes. The state of Virginia had passed a law saying anybody that challenged that law in Virginia could get 6 months in prison and $500 fines. So for quite a while, we kept going to Maryland. And finally, in June of 1960, after our final exams, nobody had challenged that law, and we decided somebody has to. So we went down to what was called a People's Drug Store, which is a chain in the Washington area, and sat down at this lunch counter to get something to eat. That's me on the far right. They closed the lunch counter and would not serve us, but the owner didn't want us arrested. He didn't want the bad publicity. So we sat there for 2 days waiting for something to eat, and it was the most challenging 2 days of my life. People came and spat at us. People put lit cigarettes down our backs. People punched us in the stomach so hard we would fall off the stool, and then they would kick us. Every time something like this would happen, we would try to respond in a nonviolent, loving way, which was pretty challenging sometimes. Toward the end of the second day, I was meditating on loving your enemies. And I heard a guy come up from behind me, and he says, "If you don't get out of this store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart." And in his hand was a switchblade. And by that time, it was pretty close to my heart. And I thought, oh, I've got 2 seconds. Do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there something else that I should be doing here? But we'd had a lot of practice, and I just looked him in the eyes, and I said, "Friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And it was quite amazing. This face that was contorted with hatred, his jaw began to drop, and his hand began to fall, and he left the store. So for a 20-year-old, this was kind of an amazing experience. We then did something even more difficult. It had been in the front page of the papers, and there were 500 people gathered outside threatening violence, including the American Nazi Party. And we wrote a statement appealing to the religious and community leaders of Arlington to use their influence to get the eating facilities open to everyone. And then this is the difficult part. We said, if nothing changes, within a week we'll be back. And that was challenging. Well, some friendly media people got us out alive and took us back to Washington, and we literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. On the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met, had talked with the business leaders, and had gotten a commitment that the eating facilities would be open within 10 days. So this was the most important lesson in my life, that when something terrible is happening, you don't have to just curse the television set or the president or segregation or war. We have the power to help change history. And that's what black students throughout the South were doing. And I think those religious and community leaders could have met and used their influence to get the eating facilities open 25, 50, 100 years earlier. But somehow we touched something in their heart that encouraged them to act. This is the next year in Berlin, where I was studying at the universities of East and West Berlin. This is what you call the University of the Streets. This was Checkpoint Charlie, and on this side are the American tanks facing toward the east. On the other side are the Soviet tanks facing the west. And I was studying, as I say, in both universities, East and West Berlin, which, as far as I know, I may have been one of the few Americans or anybody that actually did that. And I would ride my bicycle through the Checkpoint Charlie each morning, go to the university in East Berlin, and when I would hear what I considered communist propaganda, I would challenge that, and they called me a capitalist warmonger. In the afternoon, I would come back to West Berlin, and when I heard Western propaganda, I would challenge that propaganda, and they'd call me a communist conspirator. So I learned fairly early on, but that telling the truth or questioning authority, questioning the official propaganda is not necessarily popular. Well, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were threatening nuclear war over Berlin that year and for a number of years, and it was very, very scary. I then heard that you could go camping in the Soviet Union, and the Russian people at that time were our arch enemy. These were the people that we were ready to incinerate, kill hundreds of millions of them if need be, and they the same with us. So I heard you could go camping in Russia, and I got a VW Bug, and five students went, and this is in one of the campgrounds, some of the Russian people that we were meeting, and as you can tell, they look like evil communists. But if our governments won't make peace, I think it's up to us, the people, to try to make peace. One of my concerns for a long time has been nuclear weapons testing. I had been arrested in May of 1962, or perhaps it was April of '62, in front of the White House, praying for an end to nuclear weapons testing, and spent a weekend in jail. And later that summer, I was leading a second group to the Soviet Union, and decided that American bomb tests are horrendous, and the Soviet nuclear testing are horrendous. And so I made a sign in Russian saying bomb tests kill people. And here we are in the Kremlin next to the Lenin Mausoleum with St. Basil's in the background, demonstrating against Soviet nuclear bombs. Well, the Americans had said when we were demonstrating in Washington, our bomb tests are just for peaceful purposes. Go to Russia. And so here we were in Russia, and the Russian people's response was very similar. our bomb tests are just peaceful, and why don't you go to the United States? Well, the Soviet police came and threatened us with 20 years in prison, and after thinking about that for a second, we said, well, thank you for warning us, but if this nuclear arms race continues, all of us may be dead. And we've demonstrated in the United States, and we're going to demonstrate here. Luckily, they didn't arrest us, but they actually kept me out of the country for 26 years. Also, that spring in '62, 6 of us Quakers had the opportunity to meet with President Kennedy for about half an hour in the White House. And here we're having a press conference out in front of the White House when we came out. And it was very impressive to us that the president actually was listening. And he said to us, among other things, he says, I've been reading The Guns of August before the First World War, and everyone armed to the teeth to try to keep us out of war. And that's exactly what us got into war. And it's scary, the similarities between what was happening then and what's happening now in 1962, which we found out that fall when we were eye to eye in a possible nuclear destruction over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we also challenged him to challenge the Soviets to a peace race, and to take more leadership to lead us away from this nuclear Armageddon. And he looked at us and he said, if you're serious about this, you're going to have to build a much more powerful movement to help encourage me and support me to take the leadership you want me to take. Well, we kind of had our marching orders, and when his secretary came and said, Mr. President, your next appointment's here, he said, well, tell them to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers. This is during the Vietnam War. I think it was about 1969. And some Quakers were reading the names of the war dead each Wednesday at noon on the Capitol steps. Well, we'd get through 40 or 50 names, and the police would arrest us for disturbing the war, maybe we would call it that. And after about 3 weeks, I went to see Congressman George Brown, who's standing here, and said, Congressman, we've been arrested 3 weeks now for trying to read the names of the war dead. Is there anything you can do to help us? And he said, yeah, I think I'll join you. And in addition, I will write to every member of Congress telling them that I'm joining you and to invite them to join us. So the next day we had 3 members of Congress out there, and when all of us were arrested, the 3 congressmen had congressional immunity and kept reading the 45,000 names of the war dead. Well, that got national publicity, and within a couple of weeks, Life magazine had a whole issue with the photo of every American that had been killed in the war, where they were born, where they went to school, where they died, etc. And within a couple of weeks, people all over the country were reading the names of the war dead at federal buildings, at courthouses, at post offices. So even a few people can begin making ripples in the water. This is Jan, my wife Jan, and me, and you see our daughter Heidi, and our son Peter is right behind the policeman. This is also during the bombing of Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, and 250 Quakers had decided to have a quiet meeting for worship in front of the White House. President Nixon was the president. And the police came and warned us all that we would be arrested if we didn't leave. No one left. And the 250 other Quakers were all hauled off to jail. Jan and I and our 2 young children were left there sitting on the sidewalk. And this is the police chief threatening that if we were arrested, our children would be taken away and put in juvenile hall. And he says, you know what happens to children in juvenile hall. And we said, well, of course we love our children, but we also love the children of Vietnam. And we are going to continue this worshipful presence in front of the White House until we stop bombing children in Vietnam. Well, he went on for a while longer. For about half an hour, he was trying to convince us to leave. And after half an hour, I said, well, if you arrest us, we will walk to the police car. Well, he says, you're under arrest. And we walked to the police car. And instead of taking us to jail, he took us behind the police station in Georgetown and released us. And we walked back to the White House, but by that time, the police were everywhere, and we couldn't get anywhere near the White House. This photo went all across the country. The 250 Quakers got very, very little publicity, but somehow this young family seemed to be very photogenic. So people from all over the country sent us this photo because UPI and AP had sent it out. And it's now on our children's baby books. Some people think that when you get married and have children, you give up your values and your beliefs, and we can actually do something to stop war and madness, and that somehow we never had that problem. This picture is taken in 1972. In Christmas of 1971, the United States started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. We'd been bombing rice paddies and the Ho Chi Minh Trail and small towns and villages. But at Christmas time, we started bombing these cities with millions of people. And we had a worship service in West Philadelphia where we were living, and tried to feel the pain of the people that were living under those bombs, what this meant to them, to their families, not knowing if their children would be alive tomorrow, if the parents were killed, where could the children go, etc. And then we tried to look at what are we led to do to try to stop this insanity. And we somehow found the courage to somehow put our bodies between these bombs and the people in Vietnam. And we found 26 canoes, and 52 of us began attempting to nonviolently blockade the ship, which was called the USS Nitro. On the first day, as we paddled out along the pier toward the bow of the ship, a policeman, a military policeman, warned us over the megaphone, you've got to get out of this area or you'll be charged with criminal conspiracy. And that's 20 years in prison. We tried to yell back, thank you for warning us, but if these bombs reach their destination, that's even worse than 20 years in prison. On the sixth day that we were out there, we'd heard the ship was going to be leaving very early that morning. The decks were piled 15, 20 feet high with napalm and anti-personnel bombs. And when we looked up at the bow of the ship as they were lifting anchor, here were a number of the sailors giving us the V sign. And then 7 of the sailors jumped off of the ship into the ocean and began swimming toward our blockade, which was a phenomenal experience for us, something we didn't anticipate at all. We'd called the New York Times and the Evening News, so this was broadcast across the country. These guys were they were picked up and put back on the brig of the ship. But they told us later that when their ship went through the Panama Canal, all the other Navy ships had heard about the USS Nitro and the nonviolent resistance and gave them the fist of solidarity with those 7 sailors. So I like to think that our courage gave those 7 sailors courage to do what they believed was right. And those 7 sailors gave courage to a whole lot of other Americans in the war to stop the insanity of what they were being ordered to do in killing, burning villages and that kind of thing. So again, the ripple effect. You know, you can throw a little stone in the water and you never know where it ends. Well, that blockade at Leonardo, New Jersey, spread all up and down the East Coast and all up and down the West Coast. This is down in Norfolk, Virginia. That's an aircraft carrier, the USS America, and some of our small canoes in front of it. And the Navy fireboats came with their water cannon, and we thought they were going to aim at us, but they aimed at the sailors who were giving us support. We were all, they capsized our boats intentionally. The frogmen came after us, put us onto a Navy boat face down in handcuffs with guns pointed at us, while the USS America steamed out to Vietnam. The next day, the local paper had a headline saying, "America defeats peace flotilla." So, you know, finally America was standing tall again. I'm going to skip some of these. This is at Livermore Nuclear Weapons Labs, which is about 35 miles east of San Francisco. The United States has been and is developing a whole new generation of nuclear bombs. I think $10 billion is to be spent this year just on new nuclear weapons development. So we have been involved in an ongoing campaign since the early 80s. People in the religious community and students and people from many different communities working for the conversion of that plant from nuclear weapons to alternative energy and positive contributions to the world. I'll skip that one too. This is at Concord Naval Weapons Station. Also a little bit northeast of San Francisco. And at this weapons station, 80% of the bombs that went to Vietnam were shipped. And this is in 1987. Unfortunately, we were now sending arms to Central America, to El Salvador, to Guatemala, to the Contras in Nicaragua. And Brian Wilson, how many of you have heard of Brian Wilson? Who is a Vietnam vet who, in Vietnam, part of his job was to go into villages after we'd bombed to look at how effective the bombing had been. And he went into one of the villages one day, and here, all of the only people that were there were women and children and old people, all of them dead. No weapons were found. And there was this one woman whose eyebrows and eyelashes had been burned by napalm. So her eyes were looking white, right at him. And around her legs were her children, wrapping their arms around their mother, all of them dead. And Brian, who had been brought up a very staunch anti-communist, John Birch Society, started wondering, why am I 9,000 miles away from home in burning somebody else's village? Well, that was kind of a conversion experience for him. But here we were, he'd gone to Nicaragua and finding that we were doing the same thing again. And that was just too much for him, and he came back. And we decided to organize what we called Nuremberg Actions, where we were going to nonviolently try to block trucks and trains that were carrying bombs to kill people in Central America. And this is Dorothy Granada and me blocking one of the first trucks. And all of them were labeled explosives. So, you could very easily, and they were coming from munitions bunkers up on the hills, crossing this roadway taking them out to ships. Well, on September 1st of that year, Brian and a number of other veterans, Vietnam veterans, made a statement in which they said, starting September 1st, we'll be fasting for 40 days, and we will be blocking the trains that are carrying bombs to Central America. And the Navy has three choices. You can stop shipping the bombs, or you can arrest us, take us to jail, but we want you to know that the moment you release us, we'll be back on the tracks, or you can run over us. And he also said, our lives are not worth more than the people of Central America, and their lives are not worth less than ours. And I think that's a very radical way of looking at the world. I think many of us think somehow our lives are more important than people in other parts of the world. And it's all right for us to consume 6 times our share of the world's resources. And it's also all right to bomb their country if we want their oil or other resources. Well, the Navy unfortunately decided to run their train through us, through our blockade. And that's the train in the background after it's gone through. Brian has been run over by the train, lost his 2 legs, a hole in his head, 50 bones broken, but was still alive, and I'm there trying to hold the blood in his head. It was the worst day of my life. Obviously, I think what the Navy was trying to do was to say, no more of this nonsense from you guys. But instead, we had 9,000 people out there the next Saturday to commit to continuing this action. Brian survived, and actually I visited him in the hospital where every inch of his body was covered with bandages and no more legs. But I could see his eyes, and he dictated this most beautiful statement. His love and his commitment to nonviolence and his commitment to building a different kind of world where we could all be brothers and sisters was stronger than ever. And he says, I'll be back there at the tracks as soon as I can get out of this hospital. Well, we had 9,000 people there the next Saturday, and then we blocked every train for 3 years. And sometimes they would have to arrest 2 busloads of us before the train could go through. And word about what we did went throughout Central America, and for the peasants and the local people, it was so meaningful that there are Americans that are willing to risk their lives to stop the insanity of the killing that was happening in their families and their communities. This is my mom and dad, Ruth and Ray Hartsough, taken just before we were all arrested out at Concord Naval Weapons Station blocking a train. This is in the Soviet Union, and this was the year I was allowed to go back to the Soviet Union after 26 years of exile, so to speak. And there'd been a right-wing, very reactionary communist coup d'etat against Gorbachev, who had been making signs of détente with the West and glasnost, making it much more democratic, etc. Well, this coup d'etat had all the Soviet military forces at their command, all their nuclear weapons, the Air Force, and declared a total curfew. And but in spite of that, about 10,000 Russian citizens went to the White House, which you see behind us there, surrounding it, and they called it the living ring, to nonviolently face the tanks that had been ordered to come and shoot. And people would offer the soldiers food, water, cigarettes, saying, you are our sons, you are our brothers, please don't shoot. And many of those soldiers in the tanks turned the tanks around and faced out. The Air Force came and also had orders to bomb the White House. When they saw all these people, they refused to bomb. After 3 days and 3 nights, the coup leaders gave up, and some of them committed suicide, and Gorbachev was brought back from prison. This is in Kosovo in 1996, which you may remember there was a very apartheid kind of system there. 90% of the people were Kosovar Albanian, and about 7% were Serbian. And the 90% of the people had all been fired from their jobs, could not speak Albanian, they could not go to the university. They were afraid to go to hospitals because some of them had been poisoned. But the people were responding nonviolently to that oppression. And I had just come from Sarajevo, where there had been bombing of Sarajevo for over 2 years. And everywhere was fresh grave sites. And I heard that there was nonviolent resistance in Kosovo, and I decided I want to go there and find out more what's happening. Well, almost everybody in that society that I met, women, students, professors, former political prisoners, political party people, said, Kosovo is an explosion waiting to happen. We need to engage in more active nonviolent resistance, but we need to have international people to come and accompany us. David, can you find those people? And I said, well, I will try. And so I traveled around Europe, around the United States, and wrote articles and spoke on radio and television saying Kosovo is an explosion waiting to happen. They want to engage in more active nonviolent resistance, but they need international accompaniment. Can you come? And most people said, where is Kosovo? Because there'd not been a war there. And the others said, well, it sounds very important, but we're too busy. So when it did explode and there was ethnic cleansing, President Clinton got on television and said, there's ethnic cleansing happening in Kosovo. We have two choices. We can look the other way and do nothing, or we can go in and start bombing. And many of us that had known the situation in Kosovo realized there was a third alternative, which was supporting that nonviolent movement, which I think could have helped bring about the nonviolent transformation that was needed there without the billions of dollars that was spent on bombing, and without the death and destruction, and without the hatred that intensified on all sides. So that to me was a very moral wake-up call. We need a global nonviolent peace force of hundreds and eventually thousands of nonviolent peacemakers and peacekeepers that can go in to support nonviolent movements and civilian populations that are endangered by war. So the nonviolent peace, this is Mel Duncan and me, who together with many others were the co-founders of the Nonviolent Peace Force. And the Nonviolent Peace Force now has about 200 trained international peace workers working in areas of conflict where we've been invited by local peacemakers and human rights workers. And this is in Sri Lanka, but we now have about 200 people in Mindanao in the Philippines, in South Sudan, in Burma, and we're exploring a possible role in South Sudan, in Syria. This is this is Market Street in San Francisco, where when the U.S. started our shock and awe campaign, military campaign in Iraq, we were able to shut down the financial district for 3 days when this war started. And on March 19th, the anniversary of that, each year we have had a die-in representing the people that are dying in Iraq. This is Kosovo, where I visited this last April. Jeju Island in Korea. And Jeju Island is a place where there's been resistance to militarism for decades. They were resisting the Japanese occupation. And then when the Americans came in after the Second World War, they resisted the building a separate anti-communist state in South Korea. They wanted a unified Korea. And so 50,000 of the citizens, unarmed citizens, were killed in Jeju Island. Now, the U.S. military, as part of our pivot to Asia, is building, together with the Korean Navy, is building a massive new military base as part of surrounding China with military bases. And the people of this community have been resisting, nonviolently blocking trucks and cement trucks for 7 years, and bulldozers. And here you see some of the folks there. There are nonviolent movements in many parts of the world saying no to military madness and occupation and military bases, etc. This is Iran, and I've led 2 Fellowship of Reconciliation delegations to Iran in the last years. Iran is kind of one of our new, quote, enemies. These women don't look like enemies, but we're very happy to, as almost all the people of Iran, we're very happy to meet Americans who want to reach out and get to know each other as human beings. Being in a place like Iran, I mean, our government considers them the enemy. But when we've tried to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, Iran has not invaded another country for 200 years. The United States overthrew their democratically elected government in 1953. We shot down a Iranian civilian airliner several years ago, never apologized. We have surrounded their country with military bases and are bombing in Iraq and Afghanistan and have military ships off the coast. But we're considering them a threat to our security. So again, I think it's the people of the world that are going to have to force our governments to say we're not going to put up with war and killing and threats of massive destruction. This is Gaza. Also led a delegation to Israel-Palestine, and the most, I think, hopeful thing that's going on in that whole conflict right now is that Palestinians in the West Bank are nonviolently challenging the wall that is separating them from their fields. And week after week, every Friday at noon, after the worship service at the mosque on Friday noon, they are marching to the wall to demand that it be at least moved, if not removed totally, and get hit with rubber bullets and tear gas. Some of them have been deadly injured. This is in Gaza after the Israeli what was it called? Operation Cast Lead. And this woman, whose home had also been largely destroyed, was pointing out the photographs of 28 of her family members who had been killed in that attack. This is in part of the Occupy movement in Washington, D.C., where Tom Ewell joined us, and Ruth and Mike Yarrow, and where many, many people, and especially young people, thousands of people throughout this country, decided to wake up and say, we really want a government of, by, and for the people, all the people, not just the wealthy and the corporations. This is another action of the Peace Navy. That's a South African ship during the apartheid era. And in addition to the Peace Navy, we had a picket line, and out in front where the workers were going to unload the ship, the longshoremen refused to cross the picket line, and the ship never got unloaded in San Francisco. It then went to Portland, where it was not unloaded, and then to Seattle, The longshoremen refused to cross picket lines in all those places. More recently, as I'm sure you know, Israeli ships, the same thing has happened. This is, to me, one of the symbols of hope. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, in Frederick, Maryland, there was a biological warfare plant. This is back in 1959, and at this biological warfare plant, the U.S. was developing something called Q fever. 2 ounces of Q fever could kill everyone in the world if distributed evenly. And Quakers and others began a silent vigil at the entrance to this base. And my mother, the third from the right in the white dress, was a school teacher and went down in her summer vacations to be a part of this vigil. The base had ordered all the workers not to take any leaflets, not to look at these people, to look straight ahead and go into work each morning. Well, 10 years later, my folks moved to Salem, Oregon, and my mom was in a bookstore one day, and a guy came up to her and said, "Were you in that vigil at Fort Detrick 10 years ago?" And she says, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I want you to know it's because of you and the other people there that I resigned my job." So we never know, if we do a small witness, hold a candle, hold a sign, write a letter to, Congress, that can start ripples going far beyond what we'll even know about. And this is my final slide, I guess, that I'll show. Back where I showed the American and the Soviet tanks, I went back after the wall that had been torn down by the people on both sides. And instead of the tanks, here was this massive billboard with Gandhi's photo up at the top, and then Walesa down below, and pointing to a museum half a block away from Gandhi to Walesa, the history of nonviolent struggle around the world. And I thought that this was quite a beautiful transformation from threatening nuclear war to celebrating nonviolent resistance all over the world. Well, I will end by just saying, this is a drone base, which also, as you perhaps know, this is the new way of fighting wars. No Americans will die. Men here in Nevada or New York State or whatever can, play with their computers and drop bombs on people on the other side of the world. Jan and I have joined others who have been demonstrating every month for the last 3 years at the Beale Air Force Base in California, which is one of the places that these drones are operating from. I will end by just sharing something that Johan Galtung. How many of you know who Johan Galtung is? He's one of the fathers, the parents of the peace studies programs that are happening in this country and around the world. And he's worked in many conflict areas and mediated between conflicts, etc. He is saying the American empire will be over by 2020. That the people of the world are not going to put up with continued American economic, military, political domination. And so the only real question is, are we going to have one war after another, kind of fighting to keep our power and our privilege and our domination of other countries? Or are we going to join the world's people and say, we want to live in a world where we really share the world's resources, and where no country is going to be dominating, threatening, occupying other countries. So that's a little bit about my book. There are many, many more stories in my book. And I would love to open it up to questions and comments and discussion. Who would like to ask the first question? Yeah, Bruce. Thank you for your faith in me that I have some words of wisdom. In my book, at the end of the book, I have resources for further study and action, where I both have what are some things that you can do, starting from very low risk kinds of things to a higher risk. I have websites and books and films for people that want to do further study and get actively involved. And I have 10 lessons learned from my life of activism, which maybe most specifically addresses your question. And I'll just outline those. One is the importance of vision, keeping in mind where it is we're trying to go. And when you're in the midst of a war and the bombs are falling, it's hard to do that. But I think Martin Luther King had a dream of his children being able to grow up as citizens with dignity in this country. And that helped empower a lot of people. Second, the oneness of all life, that we're all one human family. And if somebody in your family is hungry, if they are suffering from war or injustice, you don't just say, well, tough, you're on the other side of the wall. We do what we can to try to help. The belief that nonviolence is a powerful force. Gandhi said nonviolence is the most powerful force in the world, and I think that's accurate. And that people all over the world are organizing nonviolently to try to help bring about change. Nurture your spirit. Take time to, whether it's through music, meditation, spending time with friends, nurture your spirit for the long haul. The belief that small, committed groups can create change. And as you know, Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Sixth, the need for sustained struggle. Doing something one day, 2 days isn't going to do it. The 400,000 people that marched several weeks ago in New York City, I think was a very important step, but it's going to take more than one big march to turn that around. The importance of good strategy. The military has been thinking strategically for a long time. Well, I think people who want to create a world of peace and justice need to think strategically. It's just as important. To develop long-range goals, develop good strategy, and sustain campaigns to achieve those goals. Overcome our fear. I think fear is one of the greatest inhibitors of action. And part of what I was trying to share with some of the stories, they say, if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to arrest you. Well, it's not necessarily the worst thing that can happen, especially if you're arrested with other people who have some similar values and beliefs. You use that time to strengthen community and et cetera. The importance of truth. I think the people that are encouraging wars often are not relying on truth. And I think people in almost every society, our governments resort to lies to get the people to go along with those wars. Because the people don't want war. But we have to be relying on truth as a major part of our movement. And finally, we need to tell our stories. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with my book. I think we need to share the stories that active nonviolence, there are things that people can do to bring about change. How many of you know the DVD, A Force More Powerful? Great. But this is a DVD professionally done. It's been on national television. It's 6 powerful movements around the world that have brought about major change. It's Gandhi's Salt March. It's the sit-ins in the South, or in segregation. It's nonviolent resistance to Hitler in Denmark. It's the solidarity movement, labor movement that transformed Poland. It's the nonviolent transformation of South Africa, and it's the nonviolent overthrow of Pinochet. So these ought to be shown in every church, every community, every university, high school, to help people feel, oh, there are other ways to help bring about change. So thanks for your question. Others? Yes? And you might just introduce or say who you are. Well, I think one is maybe trying to reframe. I mean, as I'm sure you know, 80 to 90% of the people that are dying in wars are civilians. Many, many of those, very high percentage, are children. I think that most people would argue, or would say, would believe, we don't want to kill anybody's children. It's not worth killing somebody else's children for any ideology, any political belief, any religious belief, and yet that's exactly what we're doing. That fact is hidden from many of us. So I mean, that's one thing. I think a second, and the military-industrial complex in this country has been very smart in parceling out the military contracts to make these weapons of war to every congressional district in the United States. So in every congressional district, there are people who say, we want our jobs. So Mr. Congressman, get more jobs, And I don't think that means that people want war. They do want jobs. And in this World Beyond War effort that I mentioned, we are proposing economic conversion commissions. And I think many of you probably know that the same amount of money spent on missiles, nuclear weapons, all weapons of destruction, if used building schools, more teachers per classroom, infrastructure, rebuilding bridges that are falling, alternative energy technologies, et cetera, would provide many more jobs. So it's not a question of jobs or no jobs, it's what kind of jobs. And I think the third thing that I would say is, I think empathy, or trying to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, is very important. And I don't think that there are many people who would say, I'm going to keep this job even if I know that people in some other country are going to get killed, who have nothing to do with my security. They're people trying to bring up their families and want the same things as I do. I mean, I believe enough in the goodness of human nature. I don't think people like the idea of killing other people, and that's the reason, part of the reason that soldiers coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam are having such a hard time. And they become alcoholic, and they kill themselves, and they end up in mental institutions and prisons because they've had to. I mean, they were brought up that we get along with people, and then you learn you've got to kill people, and you get a medal if you kill a whole lot of people, and then you come back home and you're supposed to forget that, and that transition is very, very hard. So, and I guess the final thing I would say is military security has not been working. I mean, September 11th, 2001, a horrendous thing happened. Terrorists hijacked planes, and 3,000 or 4,000 people died. But in response, we have been at war with Afghanistan for 13 years, with Iraq for 11 years, and I would guess that we have 1,000 times as many terrorists now as we did when we started. And if we keep continuing our present policies, we'll have 1,000 times as many as we have now 5 years from now. And so that's a dead-end street. And my own feeling is we need to try something different. And that is, instead of being at war with the Muslim world especially, that one of the things that irks them most is our military bases in their countries, and our occupation of their countries, and our supporting Israel 100% against the Palestinians. And if instead we said we're withdrawing our troops, we're dismantling our military bases, we're going to put the hundreds of billions of dollars we've been spending in war into medical clinics, Peace Corps people, educational institutions, we could become the most loved nation in the world, and I think be a whole lot safer. Other questions? Comments? And feel free to disagree with anything I've said. Well, if not, I want to thank everybody for coming. And if you haven't already gotten a book, I hope you'll buy a book. And if you're older, like I am, think about your children and grandchildren. Christmas is going to be coming before too long. And I think it's especially important that younger people feel some hope. There's something that we can do to help create a more peaceful, just world for our children and grandchildren. Yes?
Have there been any, for example, picture books for children with this message created and published?
John Lewis, I'm sure there are. I don't have them in my head.
I'll investigate it. I sell children's books, but I've never seen any.
But John Lewis, who, as you may remember, is now a member of Congress and was a part of the Nashville sit-ins, was a part of the Freedom Rides, and was part of the, when the buses were burned and people were beaten up, he and other Nashville students said, we've written our wills and we're going to go down and continue the Freedom Ride. He was brutally beat up. He was also in the front of the line in the Selma to Montgomery March, and was badly beaten by the police. There's a, what's it called? Graphic novel. And it's called March. And there's the first one, March 1, is out, but there's going to be 2 more. And they kind of share the story of of his experience in the civil rights movement from a very, very courageous guy. And I think that is certainly, that's something that's available for young people. I think it depends on what age you're talking about, but this video, or the DVD I shared, is certainly also very appropriate for high schools and our Sunday school. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I'll be happy to sign some books if you'd like me to.